Thanks so much for joining us, everyone. My name is Ceinwen, and I'm one of the co-founders and directors of Shine Cancer Support. And we are really excited tonight to be joined by Professor Gerard Evan, who is very modest, but one of the world's leading cancer researchers. So we're very grateful for his time. I think this started a few months ago, didn't it, Gerard? We were talking about could we do a webinar, and quite a few people had questions about how cancer is kind of faring in the pandemic and what's going on with cancer research. So we were just really happy to have you here. But I wanted to start off just to find out a little bit about you. So I know that you are a professor of biochemistry at Cambridge. But would you mind just telling us a little bit about how you got to where you are and what keeps you interested?
Oh, okay. Well, I guess my interest in cancer started when I was a kid. Living in London, and every week somebody would come round to collect money for cancer. And I didn't know what cancer was. I was only about 10 at the time, but it seemed horribly important and important to an awful lot of people. And then my father remarried. My mum died when I was very young, and my stepmom was working up at the London hospital in a cancer research place. So I went up there, and I got fascinated by, I guess in those days it was test tubes and white coats and various other sort of things. So without really realizing what it was, I just realized that this was something that was very important to an awful lot of people. And I became more and more interested when I was at school, and then I went to university, studied biochemistry. Then I went to do a PhD where I was working on using monoclonal antibodies to target and understand cancer. I then went to the University of California to work with Mike Bishop and Harold Varmus, who won the Nobel Prize for discovering cancer genes, oncogenes. And then I came back to Cambridge for a bit, and then I was at the Imperial Cancer Research Fund for about 12 years in Lincoln's Inn Fields in London, where I kept developing my interest in the molecular biology of cancer. And then I moved to the University of California in the late 90s, where I was a professor for about 12 years. And then I was tempted back by the glorious weather here in the UK. And it was
too sunny in California.
It was too sunny, yeah. No, but by certain things, such as the wonderful sense of humor of British people, and also, the fact that it's much kinder for your skin, all this slightly damp drizzle, and I love it here. So, and I've been back in Cambridge since 2009, and I'm here today.
Yeah. And so what do you think, obviously you've been doing this a long time, you got your PhD in 1982. What do you think has been or have been maybe the biggest changes you've seen in our understanding of cancer over that time?
I think incredibly dramatic, and not in any way that I would have predicted. So for most of the time that I've been alive and working in the area of cancer, it's been banging your head against a brick wall, an impossibly complicated disease or set of diseases, and very, very crude treatments that in many ways sometimes are just as frightening as the disease itself. And the idea that we would ever be able to have drugs that could literally just turn cancers off was just fantasy, science fiction. But that is actually what has started to happen. Obviously, it's incomplete. These drugs that now target specific, we now understand many, by no means all, but many of the specific things that go wrong in cancers and that make the cancers what they are. Because cancers are deceptively similar to normal tissues in our body. They're just in a continuous repairing mode. And the reason for that is that cells, like cars, have accelerator pedals and brakes. And the accelerator pedals make them go and divide, and the brakes stop them and make them settle down and do their normal functions. And so cancers arise because of mutations that lock the accelerator pedal down and remove the brakes. And then you get this disease. But now we know what a lot of the accelerator pedals are, and we know what a lot of the braking mechanisms are. And we also know that if we target them appropriately, we can do amazing things. We can't cure patients yet, but we can treat many, many patients, and with drugs that really are not horrible anymore. So that is, I never thought it would be this amazing, and I never thought I'd be lucky enough to be working in a field of medical biology where so much has happened that makes me so hopeful.
Yeah, I mean, it is amazing to the changes. And then, so I guess, you're kind of working on cancer. Things are maybe feeling fairly hopeful, even though a lot of people are still being diagnosed with cancer. And then we get a global pandemic, which is a new virus that nobody's seen before. And obviously, we're still in lockdown now. We've been in multiple lockdowns. We have to shut everything down and try not to catch this disease. So what has that, I guess the first question is, what has that done to cancer research? Because my understanding, or some of the things I think people have heard, is that a lot of staff have been redeployed because they're not working on cancer research anymore. They're working on COVID. I mean, what happened kind of in the first wave back in the beginning?
Well, the first wave, I think, was I was living in East Anglia. The first wave was nobody realized how long it was going to be. And I don't think even those of us who knew about coronaviruses realized how serious it was going to be. So it was a glorious May, as I recall, and everybody was sort of calm and just staying at home. And there's a huge feeling of solidarity. And everybody thought we'd be through it relatively quickly. And of course, that didn't happen. And we just went on and on and on with brief respites, which then caused another lockdown and so on and so forth. And here we are in February, where I think everybody just feels frayed and tired and fed up. For us doing research, it was okay for the first couple of months, I guess, because we were still able to do social distancing within the laboratories and wear masks. But then the University of Cambridge, for example, said, no, we've just got to shut down. We can carry on doing a limited amount of research, but we would like that research. We're interested in people who've got any ideas about COVID, about what to do, how to detect it. We're not going to stop you doing your normal research or anything else, but if you've got any ideas, for the sake of everyone else, and let's try and be clever. And we're a university and trying to, so that's what happened. So I think in my lab, we stayed. We're a cancer research lab. I wouldn't know the first thing about how to develop therapies for a virus. Okay, well, I would know the first thing, but that's just about it. Okay, but it's a disease that viral diseases are not things necessarily that my lab works on. So we kept going doing our cancer research, but in a very limited way. And then of course the students disappear. And the students, we always have undergraduate students. That's how we train them to be scientists. They come into our labs and they work with our PhD students and postdoctoral fellows and with me and the people in the lab. And they disappeared. And so we lost a lot of the dynamism and the wonder and the craziness of having young people around. And we've kept going. A lot of labs have not been able to keep going. We had to drop to 25% occupancy, which meant difficult decisions about who in each person's lab had to decide who they would allow to come in on each day, and people were signing up. And it just generally got very complicated. And for me, the thing I've been missing more than anything else is science and research is a deeply social enterprise. It's not about people sitting in rooms by themselves contemplating the infinite. It's bouncing ideas off each other, drinking endless amounts of tea in the morning, endless amounts of coffee, or is it the other way around? I can't remember. But anyway, and then going to meetings, not listening to the lectures, but then being fired up by the lectures and talking to each other about, did you hear that? That was rubbish. I don't agree with that. That's a really clever idea. This has been what's missing. And we tried our best with Zoom. And where would we be without Zoom and Teams? But there's only so much you can do when you're talking to a face rather than a human being. And so I think thank God for the vaccines is all I can say, because now we have a way out. I mean, if you imagine we were here without vaccines, where would we be? So it's been tough. But I don't think there's been a great deal of redeployment of resources from cancer research to COVID, because it's a bit like asking, woodworkers to work on metal or something like that. It's not quite like that, but you know what I mean. But people have tried as hard. There's so much commitment amongst the research community to what they're doing. I mean, this is for me, this is my way of doing something for humanity. This is all I can do, right?
Yeah.
This is what I do, and to be kept from doing that makes me feel, pretty useless at times and worthless. So we've kept on, and a lot of labs have kept on, but at greatly reduced levels.
Right. Okay. So yeah, it's the sort of the capacity, the human resource capacity isn't there.
Yeah.
And then what about the funding? Because I think that's something we had questions submitted before, and quite a few people asked about, has funding for research decreased because of the focus on COVID?
I don't think it's really significantly decreased because of the focus on COVID, but it is seriously decreased because over half cancer research in the UK is supported by charities, medical research charities. And the total hit, I think, has been 40 to 50% down in terms of revenue because, the shops aren't open, the marathons aren't running, the whole fundraising thing, which is part of the joy of being funded by cancer charities, which is you get involved in all of these things and you get to meet the people and you get to have ideas and you get stimulated and inspired by people. And that hasn't happened. And I think so there's been a huge drop in income. And I don't think there's been any diversion of income from cancer research to COVID. I think what the government appears to have done is just push a lot of money into COVID research and then developing the vaccines and all the other paraphernalia, keeping the health service going and everything else like that, which is absolutely essential. But it's just been the fact that there's a lot less money around. And that in the immediate, that's bad, but the labs are slowed down anyway because of reduced function and occupancy. But the future is the next few years is going to be tough because people work on 3 or 5 year grants. And if because there's not enough money, to fund a series of 5 year grants, then those people don't have any money for 3 to 5 years, and that particularly hurts. It hurts everybody, but particularly young people who are starting out their career. It's really tough for them because they just can't get the funding. There aren't positions in the universities and stuff like that. And also, I guess, people at the end of their careers as well, though people feel less worried about them. But, if they've got, 5 years to go and they miss getting a grant in those last 5 years, they're really sort of not going to be, they're going to be shutting their research labs. So, but hopefully it will pick up because of the generosity of the British public, which is incredible.
And because we obviously had a chat before this to kind of prepare, and one of the things you said was that you were hoping that the kind of the success of research that shows, you can create a vaccine for a new virus in a year might kind of be a shot in the arm for biomedical research, that it might inspire governments to fund research differently, or I suppose, hopefully the public as well.
It's the public, really. I mean, the government will do what it does, and this is a time where courageous thinking in our government is needed. But I think that's right. I mean, what I'm hoping is that there are people who just are not sure about science, or think that scientists don't care about the same things that they do because they're too focused, they're Mr. Spock in Star Trek or some mad professor or anything else like that. Scientists are just like everyone else. They're slightly more obsessive than a lot of people, but they have to be because they just have to get it right. But people who are worried about, the speed with which these vaccines were developed. Well, they were developed at speed because of the incredible advances in biomedical research, not because anybody's cutting corners, but because of these incredible advances in biomedical research that have happened in the last 20 years, which have completely transformed the way that we think about biology and the way that we think about how to treat people's diseases and make life better for people. So this is a product of all of that investment around the world. In science and the idea that science can do good and can change things, and I think it has, and I think it's absolutely remarkable. I mean, it's not to say that the people who may be involved in the vaccines, I know many of them, they've been working 18-hour days for a year now. I mean, I've never seen such commitment in all of my life. But they work really hard, but it has worked, and we have 3, now 4 vaccines, and probably more to come. And isn't that amazing?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And sort of, the press conference at the beginning of the week with hopefully some kind of easing up of all the restrictions by the summer would be great.
Yeah.
So we've had some questions submitted, and I just want to go through some of them that I thought we discussed and thought were really interesting. So one of them was that someone had noticed that some anti-cancer drugs, like thalidomide, I think was the example they gave, had been tested out as COVID treatments. And they were wondering, why would you do that? Why would you take a drug that doesn't appear to have anything to do with a respiratory infection and use it on COVID-19?
Yeah. No, I can understand why that's slightly strange and confusing. Who would have put those together? Does somebody just sort of go into a barrel of drugs and sort of pick one out and everything? No, it's not like that at all. The clue comes from the known mechanism of action of the thalidomide-based drugs and what they do. And first of all, COVID is two diseases. There's the flu-like disease, and then there's the response of the body to that infection. And the response of that body to that infection when it's too severe and cannot die down, cannot turn itself off, turns into this ghastly inflammatory thing where people's lungs give out and the organs give out and so on, and they get very, very sick, or they get these long-term, long COVID type symptoms, which are basically, generally speaking, hyperinflammatory conditions. So any drug that works by damping down some level of inflammation, dexamethasone would be an example of that, would potentially be able to relieve those serious secondary effects that only some people get to the virus infection. Okay, they're not antivirals. Okay, they may, who knows, there may be drugs that we don't know that have antiviral activity, but these thalidomide-based drugs are not antivirals. They regulate the immune system and the inflammatory cells in the body. And they in some cases can be used to damp that down. And so, for example, the reason that they're anti-cancer drugs for certain types of cancer, like multiple myeloma, is that they actually damp down the cells that give rise to the cancer in that disease. And so the combination of that plus a bone marrow transplant plus some mild chemotherapy has taken a disease, multiple myeloma, that used to be basically kill everybody who got it, to being a disease that can in many cases be treated and at least give a substantial extension in life. So that's been a real success story using these thalidomide and the type of drugs. So it's only a matter of, once you know what they do and how they work, you think, well, would the anti-inflammatory effect of these drugs have an effect on this secondary disease that COVID causes, which is the overreaction? And then you put those together, and that's how people work. So it's not that people are just thinking, oh, I've got this disease, and well, let's look for some old drug with a name or anything. It's all about how the drug works and what the pathology is, and that's how you put them together. It's very mechanism designed.
No, that's great. That explains a lot, actually. That's really helpful. So one of the other questions was, has anyone then looked at what happens to people who are maybe getting a lot of cancer treatments and the vaccine? So I know now we are vaccinating people before they start cancer treatment, but are there any concerns about how those interact?
Well, what you're doing with the vaccine is you're priming the immune system of the patient. You're pre-infecting the patient with something that the body thinks is the disease, but isn't the disease. But the body. Maybe I should say, the way the immune system works is it doesn't know what's going to come through the door. So what your immune system does is it generates a huge diversity by random breakage and assortment of genes, connecting genes in various ways, and it generates a huge diversity of receptors, antibodies, or these things on T cells, which combine. They're just randomly specific for all sorts of different things, and they wander around your body. And if one of them comes into contact with something that it can stick to and recognize, the cell that makes that is then told to go and reproduce and make more of that molecule. So and that takes time. So that's what's called the primary response. So it takes time, and during that time, it's a race between the infectivity of the agent, the virus or bacterium, and your ability to just build up this response of molecules that can grab hold of it and then dispose of it. And that takes time. And so the first time you're infected with this, it's a real race. And that's why we've had plagues throughout history where our primary immune system is just not up to keeping these things down, and a lot of people die. However, if you recover from it or you immunize, instead of getting it the first time, you give a surrogate of what it would be like to get it, then after the first time you've been infected with something, you've built up the huge number of these cells that make these receptors that see this foreign pathogen. And now you're ready to go. And these are much, much more efficient. As soon as they get a signal, as soon as they see it again, bang, they're off. And they replicate like absolute crazy, and they completely overrun and swarm the infection. So if you've had COVID or you've been immunized against COVID, it's not that COVID viruses can't get into you. It's just they don't stand a chance. They've been outgunned because you've already seen this before, and you're not going to be caught twice.
Right. And
so
people who are getting cancer treatment, then you're being immunized ahead of time so that you're ready to go.
So you're ready to go. The real problem is that some cancer treatments suppress the immune system. Mm-hmm. And so then you're into a sort of difficult territory about, and we still don't really know, but I think everyone now thinks the sensible thing is to immunize. But it could be that some people who don't have or have an immune system that's weaker than others don't manage to become completely immune or don't get much immunity at all. Mm-hmm. But it's still better to try. And you can tell whether you're getting immunity because you can test to see if these patients get antibodies. If they develop antibodies, then you have primed the immune system and so on and so forth. But it is true that some people who have a very weakened immune system may not become immune after the vaccine. And but you can test for that and then advise accordingly.
And actually, that's one of the treatments that I know this because I have a weakened immune system, but one of the treatments that they're looking at is, I think it's called passive immunization, where you're actually just injected with antibodies rather than the vaccine.
Yeah, so you cut to the chase. You say, look, I'm not going to ask your immune system to develop its own antibodies and go through all this rigmarole that I told you about finding the infection initially and then hitting it a second time and being able to respond. I'm going to cut to the chase. I'm going to go to somebody else who's already made them. And I'm going to take them out of that person's blood with permission, of course. And then I'm going to purify them and then put them in you. And that way you don't have to wait for your immune system to go through all the kerfuffle and everything else like that. And you don't even need your immune system to make this stuff because I'm basically going to passively immunize. And these antibodies float around, they're proteins, they float around in the body, they're little Y-shaped molecules. And they have the tops of the Y, the two tops of the Y are the receptors for these foreign things. And they go around and they stick like billy-ho to the virus when they find it. And then when they do that, they trigger a response, and some cell comes along and eats the whole thing and digests it and kills it. So they clean your system out, and you don't need to have your own immune system develop it for you. So that's passive immunization. So there was a trial earlier this year, last year, of passive immunization. A lot of people were being asked if they'd had COVID, could they donate anti-sera? And that was tried as a sort of preventative measure, not for cancer patients or immune suppressed patients, but for other patients. It wasn't particularly effective. But there again, they had their own immune system. So I don't think it's, I don't know per se how clearly it helps out immune compromised patients, but I bet it does.
Yeah.
So well, it's a good thing to be able to do. Yeah.
Keeping my fingers crossed. So we had some other questions. One of the questions we had a few about rare cancers. And somebody said, how is the pandemic affecting research for rare cancers? And will we see a long-term impact on the funding for research into rare cancers? So, I mean, I suppose you answered that a little bit, talking about the lack of funding coming from research charities.
Yeah.
But has there been a specific impact on rare cancers, do you think?
Well, rare cancers, of course, are a mixed bag. Okay, and what I mean by that is some rare cancers are very rare and they're very complex and we don't really understand it. Other rare cancers are rare, but they have very informative mechanisms that we have been able to understand. And some pediatric cancers are rather like that. They are much simpler in the way that they arise than the complicated cancers that arise in adults. for reasons we don't really understand, but some of them have a sort of developmental role. There's development gone wrong rather than what cancers are in adults, which is just things getting tired and starting to make mistakes. So it depends on the rarity of the cancer, and it depends on what the cancer is. Some rare cancers are of great fascination and interest because people feel that they can do an awful lot for cancer patients with these rare cancers because we can understand the mechanism. And those tend to be researched very, very well, obviously, because people want to feel that they're getting somewhere and they can do something. Other rare cancers are still sort of rather more mysterious. And as a consequence of that, there are often not very many people working on it. But, there's no evidence that the enthusiasm and capacity of those people has been dimmed any more than people working on any other disease because of COVID. And very often those people are they're very inspired by what it is they're trying to do. And they're quite fanatical in trying to understand these very rare cancers. So probably they've been working their way through the whole thing anyway. So I don't think there would have been anything particularly bad for rare cancers, so apart from the fact that rare cancers need research.
Sure, thanks. So just kind of moving on, I guess, to more general cancer questions. I mean, this is all obviously in the context of COVID, but one question, and we've just had it in the chat, but it was submitted before, was about the kind of question about whether cancer research and medicine have been slow to recognize the importance of diet and the microbiome, and I suppose on our, developing cancer, but also as a means of treating or controlling cancer. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, we know that diet is important in terms of predisposition to cancer. Obesity is one of the major predisposing factors to a whole variety of different cancers. And then we also know that if you don't eat healthily and you don't have vitamins and various other things, you can also be more prone to various types of cancer. So eating well is absolutely the right thing to do, and not overeating is absolutely the right thing to do. Although we now know that actually most of the reason that a lot of people tend to overeat is because they what makes you hungry is a hormone that satiates you. When you've eaten, this hormone rises and makes you feel full. And some people don't have it, and also golden retrievers don't have it either. Which is they're seriously, that's why they're continuously hungry all the time. They'll eat until they're violently sick, and then they'll eat more because they just always feel hungry. And those of us who have,
my cat is missing that one as well, actually.
Yeah, well, anybody who owns a golden retriever, and a lot of people who own Labradors know that feeling at all. And they can't help it. And this is also true of a lot of human beings. Your weight is your weight. And actually, there's some very interesting work lately, which is if you do exercise, even if you do huge amounts of exercise, your calorie use is pretty much the same. The Maasai people in Africa who are on their feet the whole day, they burn the same number of calories as people who are sitting around down at a desk most of the day. Most of it goes to keep your body working and your brain working. But what it means is that keeping fit is good, because it moves the mass of your body around. It mobilizes fat tissues, and we now know that fat tissues can be very inflammatory, and that general inflammation predisposes to cancer. And there's a lot of people now trying to work on what the relationship is between weight and diet and fat deposits and cancer. And it's a complicated thing that involves the whole body. So it's absolutely right that if you need to eat well and eat right. The question about whether there are foods which can be used therapeutically or have therapeutic value, I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of epidemiologists in the world working in many different countries, analyzing different ethnic groups that move from one country to another during migration and various other things, and does their cancer risk change and various other sort of things. And I would have thought by now that if there'd been some really cool foods that really treated cancer or suppressed cancer enormously, we would know what they are by now, and they haven't really been found. And what scientists would really want to know, because the first thing they'd want to know is what is it inside that food that can be used to treat cancer. We know that certain foods and certain plants have minute traces of chemicals in them which have been used as cancer therapies. extracted yew trees and various other sort of things. But the chemicals in these plants are there to keep insects at bay. And in fact, most of those plants, we've bred out all the chemicals because the chemicals taste bitter and unpleasant. So, you know, what we think of as a naturally occurring cabbage is not what the wild cabbage is, which would have been almost inedible and would have been used as a herb rather than a vegetable. So I don't know, but I keep an open mind. And if it makes people feel good and they like doing it, then go ahead, absolutely fine. It would be wonderful to be wrong.
But what about the concept of the kind of the gut biome? I don't know if you know much about this, but you know, there is quite a lot of talk, certainly I think in the cancer community, about, you know, its role in keeping you healthy. I've seen some stuff about Alzheimer's as well.
Yes.
And different autoimmune diseases as well. So is there any evidence that having, I don't know, a more diverse biome is useful?
I'm not an expert on this, but I know a few people. I've got a very good friend in San Diego who at the Salk Institute, Janelle Ayers, who works on this. And I mean, this is a whole new area of biology. I think what I'd be prepared to say is there's clearly a lot of stuff going on that we don't understand. It's complicated. We are outnumbered 10 to 50 to 1 ourselves by bacteria. For every one of our cells, there's 10 or 50 bacteria in our guts and in our skin and in our mouths and various other things. So we are a community organism, and that is a delicate, well, it's a balancing act that seems to be quite robust, but can be perturbed. And different people have different microbiomes in their guts and so on and so forth. And it clearly has something to do with the risk for all sorts of diseases, particularly inflammatory diseases. I think it's worth remembering that primitive man, who would have been dead at the age of 20, by the way, was riddled with all sorts of parasitic worms and diseases and various other sort of things. And that would have been what humans evolved in. So, for example, there's this theory, I don't know how valid it now is, but there's certainly one idea that you can be too clean and healthy about things, and having a mixed microbiome with some dirt and some ick in it every now and again is actually quite a good thing. I certainly think there's evidence to support the notion that keeping a diverse group of foods going into your tummy is a good thing to do. And, you know, there's whether that means that fermented foods are good and cheeses are good. I mean, I used to eat a lot of cheese until I realized how fattening it was. But I eat cheeses that most people would run away from. But as far as I'm concerned, that's good for my microbiome.
Okay.
But I don't know if it is, but that's what I believe in, and I enjoy eating it anyway. So, but there's a lot going on there.
Yeah.
I don't have the answers. Nobody has the answers, and there could be some real surprises there. So I'm not going to say no to eating certain foods or finding cancer treatments in certain foods.
Sure. No, great. Thank you. One of the other questions we had, sort of going back to COVID and the vaccine, which is an interesting one, is why do I still have to shield? So, you know, a lot of the people in our community have been shielding for a year. I just got a letter myself the other day saying basically stay indoors until the 31st of March. But if you've had the vaccine, why would they tell you to continue to shield?
Well, I think it's at the moment it's safety. The vaccine gives very good protection, but it doesn't give universal protection.
Okay.
So I think, you know, what's happening here is this is constantly a compromise. I mean, you know, to a virologist, it will be lock everybody down for the next 10 years. Okay, you know, then we'll squeeze this out, but that's not going to happen. So the question is, where do you draw the balance and draw the line? So if you're immunized, your risk of coming down with COVID is greatly reduced, provided your immune system is up and running and okay, everything else. I think how well protected you are is still being evaluated. And then the level to which you are, if you're not protected, at risk from other people around you who have the virus because they haven't been vaccinated. Again, that is another set of risks that we're trying to reduce as much as possible by making the vaccine as widespread as possible, so there'll be fewer people carrying the disease. I think what's not talked about, though, to me, is the most important thing, which is These vaccines are very, very effective as far as I can understand. I did a lot of work before this afternoon. I was reading up for loads of stuff. They're very, very effective. All of them that have been used, very effective at preventing the really serious disease. So my feeling for me, and I don't have a suppressed immune system, and I'm not ill, but for me, I don't mind if I come down with COVID if I get a few aches and pains and a headache. What I don't want is to end up on a ventilator or dead or with long COVID, persistent inflammatory disease and post-viral syndromes and everything else like that. So I think, if we got to the stage where most people were vaccinated, and I understand some people don't want to be, but if most people were vaccinated and the major risk was of a sort of relatively mild flu-like disease, I think we could all relax and then nobody would need to shield. But at the moment, we're in this transition period where nobody really knows how well protected a vaccinated person really is, and therefore the degree to which they should shield. And nobody really wants to take risks and chances with people's lives.
Sure. So just going back to the vaccine, I mean, there are obviously some people who think if you get vaccinated, then Bill Gates will kind of know what you're doing. But I just wonder if, in kind of all seriousness, if you could maybe just talk us through, I guess, why we should be confident that the vaccine has been well developed and, that it's not kind of just a, I don't know, like a hack job that they bodged together really quickly.
Right. Okay. Well, there's two things. First of all, there's the mega conspiracy theory, the microchip that's going to go in your arm and everything else like that. I mean, a moment's thought is, well, what's the microchip going to be plugged into? You got to work all this out, and how's that going to, and anyway. And then, personally, why would anybody be that remotely interested in my comings and goings and where I am? They can do it on my phone anyway. So the technology is just, it's not there, and nobody's doing it. The issue about the vaccines were produced quickly, and are they safe? And well, I think we know they're effective with all the caveats I said, but are they safe? Well, the things about vaccines in the main, and there is an exception with these two RNA vaccines, they're a new type of vaccination. But the thing is, vaccines are a generic type of thing that we've been vaccinating people with for ages. We've had flu vaccines and diphtheria vaccines and various other sort of polio vaccines and everything else. And we know how they work, and we know what they do. And we know, therefore, what the likely side effects are and what the most extreme side effects would be, which could be a hyperreaction to it. Normally in vaccines, when you get a hyperreaction to a vaccine, to a flu vaccine, it's not to the vaccine itself, it's to the thing that's in the vaccine, the albumin, and there isn't any of that in these COVID vaccines. So, really, there's not a lot to go wrong. The worst thing that could really go wrong would be that they don't really provide very much immunity. And we've already had some of these vaccines. So each one is immunizing a patient with a different type of version of this bit of the COVID virus. And some of them really didn't work very well. But we've got ones that do work very well. And for example, once the hope is that once the AstraZeneca vaccine, for example, has been proven to be safe, then if it needs to be tweaked for a new variant of the virus, essentially it's the same thing going in. It's just like flu. You don't have to every year go through, spend 5 years with the new variant flu virus. You just recompile it and mix it up, and then in it goes to patients all the time. So it'd be more like that. So I don't think vaccines are a high risk medical intervention by any means. I don't think there's very much risk at all. But the good they can do is incredible. So just imagine going back 200 years when people were dying of cholera and smallpox and polio and all these things. The average age in industrial London was, I don't know, 25 or 30 when you were old when you were 40. Just imagine going back to those people and saying, I can put something in your arm that just you barely feel, and it will make sure you don't get these diseases. I mean, they think you were a wizard, a saint or something. This would be a miracle. And that's what we can do as human beings. So
can you just explain maybe a little bit? You said the RNA vaccine is new.
Yeah.
That hadn't been done before. So what's actually been done? Why is it new, and why hadn't it been done before?
Oh, okay. Well, it hadn't been done before because I don't know the details, but essentially the principle is very simple, which is RNA is a molecule which can program a cell for a short period of time to make a particular protein. And that's because it's the way that your genes are connected to the proteins that you make. And the proteins you make are what make things happen in the cell. They're the hands and feet and and tentacles of the cell. They move stuff around, and they're all proteins. And proteins are linear molecules that fold up into complicated shapes, which then acquire these amazing functions as motors and engines and things that can grab hold of other things and so on and so forth. And they're coded by DNA, which is another long, thin molecule. And the intermediary is RNA. So DNA is read into an RNA molecule, which is then decoded into protein. It tends to go one way. So the RNA can't go into the genome. Okay, there are viruses that do that, but this RNA doesn't, because it doesn't have any mechanism for doing that. But what it can do is it can co-opt a cell for a short period of time to make the thing that you want to raise immunity against. The other way of doing it, which is the more conventional way of doing it, and the trick there is to get the RNA into the cell, because RNAs are charged molecules, don't get into cells. So you have to put them in tiny lipid droplets, and that technology is also developed. So it's a combination of two technologies. The great advantage of it is that if you need to tweak it, you just change the sequence very quickly, and you've got essentially the same molecule with just slightly different sequence for the new variant of COVID, and in it goes. And you've just, just like that, and you've worked out how these molecules will get into the muscle cells in your arm, how long they'll last, now how safe they are, and various other things. The other way of doing it is to make a version of the spike protein, or the outside of the virus, in a vat, in a bottle, in a sterile bottle, and then you purify that, and then you give that to the patient. So one basically, the new version, which is actually very cool, it programs your cell for a short period of time to make the thing you want to be immune against, and the other makes the thing you want to be immune against and shoves it in your arm.
Okay.
So yeah, so that's the real difference, and it's an amazing technology, and it'd been shown to work, but it had never been rolled out as a vaccine yet, and it waited for COVID to come along and show that it works.
And do we know which one is more effective?
Not really. I mean, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, which are both RNA vaccines, seem to be very effective. The AstraZeneca vaccine, these clinical trials, one of the problems is these clinical trials were all done with large numbers of people, but large numbers of people, you couldn't spend, 2 years just doing it on the over 65s, get enough over to 65s, 2 years doing it on the under 13s and everything else. So it was an all comers thing. And so what's happened, and I find this really rather strange, which is because there was no, with the AstraZeneca vaccine, they didn't have enough people over 65 to call the level of immunity just in the over 65s. They just knew if you took everybody together, you got very high immunity. So then some people say, well, that's evidence that it doesn't work in the over 65s. And that's not right. Evidence of absence is not the same as absence of evidence. So there was just absence of evidence. And now, of course, we know that it works perfectly well in the over 65s. But meanwhile, some world leaders have said, oh, it's a bit dodgy, this AstraZeneca. It never was. We just didn't know, and now we do know, and it's fine. But it's unfortunately, I think, done a lot of damage to confidence in vaccines.
Yeah,
that some of them don't work, and they all work. They all work amazingly well.
No, it's great. Thank you. So we've got about 15 minutes left, and I wanted to just say to everyone here, if you want to pop some more questions in the chat, please do. I just wanted to, I guess the last big question I had for you, because I think the first time I heard you talk, you were speaking about how you were just really hopeful that kind of your children wouldn't live in a world where the same number of people died of cancer. And I just wondered if you could maybe say a little bit more about how you're feeling about the direction that cancer research is going in, and maybe what the big things we should be looking out for are as well.
Okay, well, let me make it clear, because I got into trouble with the Daily Mirror on this one. they are my children, but they're in their late 20s and early 30s, so they are not children. They are my children. Okay, so I'm, because I got accused of not understanding or thinking enough about childhood cancer, which I do think a lot about. So what I was trying to say was that by the time that they are my age, in 20, 30 years' time, I think cancers are unlikely to be the great fear that everybody lives with in the way that they do in this day and age. I'm not saying cancers will be eradicated, but we've seen such huge advances in our ability to understand how cancers work and our ability to understand how to set them straight by blocking particular things that have gone wrong in them, that I think it's inevitable that there will always be cancers that are difficult to treat. And so the progress that you will see, that we have seen, is it turns out that there's an Achilles heel in one particular cancer, not a treatable cancer. Suddenly an untreatable cancer becomes a treatable cancer because we found out something about it, like multiple myeloma. The thalidomide-like drugs work incredibly well with a bone marrow transplant. Now people can a lot of people can live, decades after the disease, whereas before there was no treatment for it. So what we'll see is a piecemeal set of solutions, because cancers are lots of different things and patients are lots of different people, and some of them have great immunity and others don't, and some are men and some are women and some are, and so on and so forth. So everybody's different, but nonetheless there will be a chipping away and a gradual but a progressive, irreversible improvement in our ability to treat cancers. And I think in 20 or 30 years' time, we'll be looking at a picture where cancer isn't the thing that people worry about, or they don't worry about it. I mean, now there's this feeling, cancer is it's not the most horrifying of diseases. It is a horrifying disease, but I'm not saying it's worse or better than anything else, but it is one of those diseases which haunt people all the time. Yeah. Everyone's worried that it's growing in them. But part of the problem is I don't think we scientists have done a very good job explaining what cancers are and demystifying them and getting rid of the mythology about there's something growing inside you and everything. I know that cancers are basically perfectly normal cells that have just got the gas pedal shoved down and they can't turn it off. And what we know now is if you prise it off, actually the cancers will go away. Okay, and that makes it sound very simple. It's not that simple, but essentially that's what we know will happen if you prise the accelerator pedal back off the floor. So I think it's very hopeful. I've lived through a time when cancer drugs were just chemotherapy, conventional chemotherapy, and it was just a question of how you mix them together in various combinations, to drugs now that can make tumors melt away. Okay, maybe not forever, but melt away without any side effects. I mean, that is incredible. And I've seen that happen. So I'm incredibly optimistic. It'll never be over, but I think it'll look very different in 20, 30 years' time by the time my children are my age.
No, thank you. And I think, even for myself, I've been doing this for about 10, 12 years. And since I was diagnosed, that's something that I've seen. People who I maybe met 10, 12 years ago, who you think before that maybe wouldn't have survived, yes, are still indeed going. And it's great. And it's been wonderful. Yeah. One question someone's asked was, it might be a bit gloomy, but could you say something about the impact of COVID on trials? And this is actually something a few people have raised, because I think clinical trials have been disrupted, I assume a little bit because of what you were talking about, the staffing. Yeah. Could you say a bit more about that and when they might be able to get back on track?
Well, I think they have been disrupted. They've been disrupted because nobody wanted to pull people into hospitals. So I think that was inevitable, and I think it's tragic. I think everything relies on getting a vaccinated population and the risk of catching COVID as a serious disease dying away or dying down sufficiently that people can then start taking the risk. I mean, the problem you've got in a hospital is you want to treat all the patients you can. You want to put as many through the clinical trials as you can. for the sake of everybody, themselves and everybody else. But do you really want to invite that person to a hospital where there's an increased chance of them coming down with COVID, or bringing them in when they don't realize they've got COVID and giving it to someone else? It's just, so as soon as that begins to die away, and that's not trivial, but I think, I would hope by the summer. I'm not a politician, by the way. So, I'm just saying, I would hope by the summer. I think what's happening with the vaccine is incredible in the UK. It's nice to know we got something right, okay? But boy, did we get it right. And I think what we will wait and see is that the level of infection really does start to plummet as more and more people get vaccinated and more people are safe. And the vaccinations go down to the 50-year-olds and the 40-year-olds and the 30-year-olds, and then everybody gets vaccinated who wants to be vaccinated. I think once we see that, the clinical trials will start again, but not until then. It's just it's not a calculation that anybody wants to make running a clinical trial to have people on that trial catching COVID in the hospital in which the trial's being conducted.
Sure.
And so I think it is sad, but we'll be back on track. We'll be back on track.
Yeah, there's light at the end of the tunnel.
There really is.
Someone else has asked, so I've got breast cancer, but was on a trial for an immunotherapy drug that's usually used on people with lung cancer. Mm-hmm. So why do some drugs work for some cancers and not others? And why would you put somebody who's got breast cancer on a lung cancer drug?
Right. Okay, well, this is exactly what my lab works on, okay, which is why are cancers from different tissues different from each other? And they're wildly different from each other. So most pancreas cancers look pretty much of a muchness, look the same. They're diagnosed on the basis of how they look, and they look different from lung adenocarcinomas, for example. And lung adenocarcinomas look different from liver hepatocellular carcinomas. So, and even when the same mutations are driving those cancers in different tissues, they look different. So what that tells us is that cancers, the way that cancers look is a property of the organ in which they arise, not of the mutations which are causing the cancer. Because otherwise, that's why lung cancers of a particular kind all look like each other, even though they may have different mutations driving them and everything. Mm-hmm. So what we think is going on is that what cancers do is they hack a program in each of our cells, in each of our tissues. So what is that program? Well, that program is what happens if you damage that tissue and you need to rebuild it. So if you look at a damaged tissue, which is rebuilding after an injury or an infection like the lung or anything else, then much of what's going on has the hallmarks of an early stage tumor in that tissue. The difference is tumors don't stop, whereas recovery and inflammation and regeneration do. So we've been working on this idea that essentially cancers are a hacked regenerative program. And the regenerative and mending a pancreas is different from mending a liver, is different from mending a lung, because they're different tissues, they do different things. Now, just because they're different doesn't mean to say that different things are driving it. Okay, so that's the thing. So just because you have a lung cancer that looks like that doesn't mean to say that the pancreas cancer, which looks like this, is actually being driven by different things. In fact, we showed formally the same mutations can drive those very, very different looking beasts, very different looking diseases. So that's true. Then there's at least a good possibility that there's common features across cancers, despite how different they are. Now, at the moment, the technologies are very good at looking at the differences between cancers. We can sequence each patient's cancer, and every cancer is a bit different from every other cancer because these mutations arise by random mechanisms and they accumulate in cells. And so actually, in most patients, each cancer cell is different from every other cancer cell. It's just a melee going on, right? But just because there's all this huge heterogeneity and difference doesn't mean to say that the fundamental mechanisms for all of those cells and all of those cancers don't share features. And this is a split there's two ways of looking at cancer. There are those who look for the differences and those who look for the commonalities. And we're on the commonalities side. And the reason we're on the commonality, it's very unpopular, by the way. So, because people looking at differences, there's so much to do and go on and you can investigate. But we really believe that there are commonalities underpinning cancers. And if you could target the commonalities, you could have generic anti-cancer drugs. So the fact is, nobody knows. But what you do find is that the drugs that can be used for certain cancers can often be reapplied to other cancers, and quite successfully, though often in different combinations, suggesting that there are commonalities. But this is a very fertile area for the thought, cancer thinking, cancer research at the moment, and a very exciting one. Just imagine that just because cancers all look different, they actually are all driven by the same things at the heart.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that will be a quite amazing discovery, and that's what I think is going on. But that's my personal view.
Yeah. No, that's great. Gosh, we've had loads of questions come in, and then I think we're not going to have time to answer them all because we've only got 3 more minutes. And a couple of people also saying thank you so much, and you're amazing. So thank you.
It's very kind of you all. Thank you.
But I guess one question that was asked early on, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, but a lot of people who have been shielding were also recommended to take vitamin D. And actually the government, I got a nice little package in the post from them of vitamin D. So was that about fighting COVID, or was that about keeping us healthy for other things? Do you know?
Well, I take vitamin D. I've taken 20,000 units, or 2,000 units rather, since I gave a talk at Mount Sinai Medical Center in New York back in 2002. And my host there was a person who worked on colorectal cancer. And he said, oh no, vitamin D, you got to, sorry, he said vitamin D, not there, vitamin D, that's the thing. And I said, all right, I'm taking it, that's good. It certainly is useful for the immune system. Vitamin D is more like a hormone than it is a vitamin, a trace element. It's used as a signaling molecule to regulate, for example, it regulates the interaction between fatty tissues and non-fatty tissues. There's trials of high dose vitamin D or versions of vitamin D, drug versions of vitamin D for use in pancreatic cancer, for example. So there is a lot of interest in it as a therapeutic entity, but it also has very general functions in propping up your immune system, in all sorts of things. So it's actually necessary, and the only way that you can make it is sunlight plus eating it through special supplements. And there's I think some sea plankton or something that make it, and you could, or whatever else, and seaweed or various other things. But sunlight is really where most people make it, and that's difficult in the northern hemisphere, high up as we are, and it is particularly difficult for people of color because the sunlight doesn't get through their melanin shields. So I would advocate taking vitamin D, but I don't have huge amounts of evidence that it's going to do you a huge amount of good, but I sure know it doesn't do you any harm. So.
Well, that is probably an excellent note to end on, because we want to do people good and no harm.
Indeed.
And hopefully the vaccine will do that for all of us in due course as well. But Gerard, thank you so much. This has been really wonderful. And I think just from the questions that have come in, right, we'll probably have to get you back, because
please do. But it's been an absolute...
we could do this all evening. But thank you to everyone who joined us. And we will put this on YouTube as well. I'll let you guys know that, so you'll be able to share it or go back and watch it again if you'd like. But thank you very much, and have a good evening.